Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. Tonight, one Israeli hostage has been released, while 3 more are filmed by Hamas. I'll speak with the emotional father of a young girl who was killed at the dance festival. He says Hamas has to be destroyed.
We're now at a defense operation and we need to eliminate Hamas, and anyone associated with Hamas needs to be eliminated, the same as the Western world has done to ISIS.
Legal experts warn the government's misinformation bill will afford fewer rights than those accused of murder. Legal expert Sam Macedoni will join me later. And Tony Burke's U-turn on some of his key IR reforms. Well, how did he get it so wrong? Ross Greenwood will be here to discuss shortly. But first tonight, to Israel's war on terror. Israel rescues 1 hostage in a difficult operation while a new axis of evil emerges. Netanyahu rightly rejects calls for a ceasefire, and US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says Israel and Egypt are prepared to let hundreds of Palestinian foreign citizens leave, but Hamas has refused. In one glimmer of good news, Ori Megadesh, a young female soldier held hostage, has been rescued by Israeli special forces. Ori, just a teenager at 19, was captured by Hamas while serving at a lookout on the southern border. She's now the first to be brought home by Israel's intelligence services and special forces as part of the ground operation in Gaza. And she had an emotional reunion with her family, and dozens of people who don't even know her gathered outside her family's home to celebrate. One rescued, 238 more to go. Hamas released a hostage video of 3 Israelis who make demands for a ceasefire and the exchange of prisoners. They attack the Netanyahu government. One angrily demands that Netanyahu set them free. Israeli media hasn't shown the video because it's part of Hamas's propaganda campaign, and here Sky News has made a decision not to show any hostage videos. This war that Israel was forced into after the October 7 terror attacks can't be seen in isolation from world events. Hamas is financed and armed by Iran, which reportedly gave the terror organisation the green light to attack Israel. There's now an axis of evil that's emerged, an anti-Western alliance between Iran, North Korea, Russia and China. Foreign Affairs editor for The Australian, Greg Sheridan, today writes that the strategic cooperation between these 4 nations is now intense. He writes there's an axis of evil that's emerged, an anti-Western alliance. He says North Korea is supplying weapons to Russia. The day US President Joe Biden visited Israel, Vladimir Putin was in Beijing, lavishly hosted by Xi Jinping. He writes that Putin, in turn, hosted Hamas leaders in Moscow. Iran supplies deadly drones in large quantities to Russia, and Putin has pledged Russia's long-term support for North Korea. Sheridan writes that not since World War II has the West been so strategically threatened as today. All of the West's most powerful and important enemies are involved in military attack against it, or supporting attack by their allies, or proclaiming they plan to attack soon. And Sheridan goes on to write about how the mass demonstrations we're seeing around the world are often blatantly anti-Semitic. And he writes that the momentary outrage we saw has basically effectively disappeared. It's actually unbelievable how quickly the world moved on from the October 7 terror attacks to now demand of Israel a ceasefire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has overnight categorically ruled out a ceasefire, as he should.
Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war.
Now, a ceasefire would let Hamas continue to butcher and slaughter and burn Jews unimpeded. The Times of Israel's editor, David Horowitz, writes about this phenomenon, and he clearly explains the anti-Semitism that's behind the demand for a ceasefire. He says the shock is expanding now to horror, disappointment and fury at the shift outside Israel from brief initial empathy for all those whose lives were shot and burned and butchered away, for their bereft and broken families, and for the innocent snatched away into Hamas's underground hellholes, to a rising global effort to deprive us of the right to ensure it will not happen again. He writes, a rising global effort propelled by Israel haters and anti-Semites, assisted by falsehoods and misrepresentations everywhere, from TikTok to supposedly responsible media, and inflated by fools, to try to halt our military response or limit and undermine it. He says basically to tell us that what happened on October 7, if it happened, was terrible, but we need to get over it, subverting never again and telling us instead, well, yes, almost certainly again. Really powerful words and a powerful column from him in the Times of Israel. And as Horowitz so eloquently wrote, at the very heart of the calls for a ceasefire is anti-Semitism, that Hamas should be allowed to continue to slaughter Jews. He points out that if Hamas is not stopped, the monsters will be back stronger and more inhumane. Well, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong should take note, because they have horrifically been lecturing Israel about how it should respond, advocating a humanitarian two-day pause, giving Israel military advice about where and how to attack. How embarrassing. Is it any wonder Netanyahu still hasn't returned Albanese's phone call from 3 weeks ago? Albanese and Penny Wong need to think about the advice they are giving, because Israel goes above and beyond its obligations under international law to protect civilian life. Israel has evidence that Hamas is operating under the Shifa hospital, but it hasn't taken action in order to protect the lives of its enemy. The fact that the Albanese government has been so arrogant as to offer unsolicited military advice to Israel is something the former prime ministers alluded to in the letter they co-authored that supported the Jewish community. The letter that John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison all wrote. In summary, it said that there's no place for anti-Semitism. They express support for Israel and the Jewish community, as well as Australian Palestinians who've lost family members. And they went on to explain how Hamas is solely responsible for this war, how Hamas is killing both Israelis and Palestinians. Instead of lecturing Israel, as the Albanese government has done, this letter said this line, have a look. On the battlefield in Israel and Gaza, we do not presume to give strategic advice to Israel, but the legitimate objective of defeating Hamas must be accompanied by support and protection for the civilian population of Gaza. Israel promises it will do all it can to avoid civilian casualties. We urge it to do so with all of its humanity and skill. I mean, compare that language to Albanese and Penny Wong's. And the start of the statement by the former PMs was an unequivocal censure of anti-Semitism. And I'm going to read this part again. I did last night, but I'm just going to read this short part again because it's so healing to hear the former Prime Minister say that actually this anti-Semitism we're witnessing, we're experiencing, is not acceptable. They wrote, and I quote, "There is no more tenaciously evil race hatred than anti-Semitism. Our Australian Jewish community, directly affected by the terrible crimes of Hamas, not only has to endure the loss and suffering of their families in Israel, but now sees these events being used by some to spread ancient hatreds which have inflicted so much suffering on the Jewish people for thousands of years. We believe we speak for the vast majority of Australians of all faiths and of none when we say we stand in solidarity with Jewish Australians at this time. It genuinely is a brilliant letter that strikes the right tone, and all of those former PMs should be praised for it. It makes me genuinely sad that none of these leaders are here to protect the Jewish community, to stand in solidarity with the Jewish community and with Israel at this time. Any one of those former PMs, however flawed, would be a better friend to Israel and Jewish Australians than Albanese, would show more leadership at this troubled and traumatic time. Today, Albanese, briefly back on Australian soil, was asked if he supports this letter by the former PMs. He couldn't utter the words to say he supported it. He didn't support it. Have a look.
I support the positions that I've taken, and the position in the Parliament last Monday was done with overwhelming support. It is important that we recognise that the attacks from Hamas on Israel are worthy of absolute condemnation in an unequivocal way. It's also important to recognise that Israel has a right to defend itself, but how it does that matters. And we need to make sure as well that every civilian life is valued, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian. Every innocent loss of life is a tragedy. And that is why we remain very concerned and continue to put forward our case while we've provided humanitarian assistance as well to Gaza. Some $25 million has been provided so far.
The Albanese left-wing beating heart has never been more exposed on international affairs, at what some believe is an inflection point in history, than comparing his words today with those of the previous 6 prime ministers. Why doesn't Albanese call on Hamas to protect their own civilians by letting them flee to safety in the south? Why doesn't he call on pro-Palestinian supporters to condemn and denounce the hatred of Jews which is spilling out onto the streets of Sydney and Melbourne? Why doesn't he call out the blatant anti-Semitism in those pro-Palestinian protests and the barely disguised anti-Semitism erupting at university campuses, in arts communities and in other institutions? Why can't he be clear? Why isn't he, in no uncertain terms, condemning Islamic terror, which at its core has a hatred of Jews and infidels, including the United States and, of course, Australia? It's hard not to conclude that Albanese's long-held position as a radical anti-Israel activist is now driving decisions out of the lodge. Yes, he utters some words of comfort, but to many in the Jewish community, it's how he says it and what he isn't saying that has left so many disappointed. Why hasn't the Australian Prime Minister managed to speak to the leader of one of our greatest allies, Israel, a friend whose security forces thwarted a terror attack in Australia and whose democratic values we actually share? Well, perhaps it's because since becoming Prime Minister, Albanese no longer recognised West Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and that was a bungled announcement that gave Israel no warning. Then his government described East Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza as occupied Palestinian territories, denying any Jewish claim to Jerusalem. And he described Israeli West Bank settlements as illegal under international law. Under Labor's updated policy, Judaism's holiest sites, the Temple Mount and the Western Wall, are now considered to be an occupied Palestinian territory. Albanese personally has a long history of anti-Israel commentary, and I've shown it to you several times in this program. It's why he's now speaking about Israel's war on terror with both sides of his mouth. We have a crisis of anti-Semitism. Yes, globally, but also right here in Australia. There's intergenerational trauma from Holocaust survivors and the children of survivors. Mothers are terrified about sending their children to school. Teenagers are scared to walk on the streets. And Albanese, back on home soil this week, has done nothing about it. He hasn't addressed it. He hasn't said a word. Our leaders have failed to utter a word of comfort. This is catastrophic. Jewish communities feel unsafe. Everyone else is speaking about it. It's front page of the Australian newspaper today, and even the Today Show covered it this morning.
Well, what is worrying me out here and in Australia and other parts of the world is this surge in anti-Semitism. I mean, why is there this underlying level of hatred towards Jews? When we've got 100,000 Jews in Australia, 800,000 Muslims, and yet we've got this developing tension that really worries me. It even legitimised some idiots outside our courts last week saying Heil Hitler. There is a lot of my Jewish friends, I was talking to one who's in Europe at the moment, he's frightened to go out in Europe. And a lot of them have been telling me this anti-Semitism is building, and it seems to be happening now. We've got to stop it.
Stronger words from Neil Mitchell than we've seen from our Prime Minister. In Australia, we're seeing a crisis of anti-Semitism and a crisis of leadership. All right, let's bring in now business editor and host of Business Now, Ross Greenwood. Ross, great to see you. Look, one thing that we haven't spoken about much on this program is what effect the war is going to have on oil prices and whether there will be other flow-on effects for our economy from what's happening in the Middle East.
So this is the interesting thing about this, Sharri. When you talk about the axis of evil and those countries which are really lining up, remember one of those that strategically is important right now is Iran. And the reason why it's so important is because it's a major oil producer. Russia also a very big gas producer. But remember, part of its defence, if you like, or its attack on Europe after its war on Ukraine was to chop off gas supplies going into Western Europe. Now, the West has largely started to adapt to that, and it's found alternative supplies. But in terms of the Middle East, effectively, if you get a more significant conflagration in the Middle East as a result of Hamas's attacks on Israel, then you really do start to consider destabilising the global economy. And that may be very much a part of the strategy. Because remember that after COVID, many of the Western governments are full of debt and really don't have necessarily capacity to really shore up their own economies against another crisis, at the same time that they're also trying to fund Ukraine and also then provide support to Israel. So this becomes a very delicate geopolitical balance. And it all comes down to what you're paying for fuel prices, but ultimately the supply of energy around the world and those who supply it.
But just before we move on from Israel, I should point out that the father of one of the young girls who was killed at the music festival on October 7 is going to be on my show a bit later in the hour. Now, Ross, we've got another RBA board meeting next Tuesday, Melbourne Cup Day. They're eyeing another rate rise. At the moment, we've got more than 500,000 mortgage holders are set to roll off fixed mortgages onto much higher variable rates in the coming months. What do you expect Michelle Bullock, the new governor, will do on Tuesday?
Well, it comes down to the level of Michelle Bullock's independence. Now, there's no doubting that everybody maintains that the Reserve Bank governor is independent. The second thing about this is that the governor and her staff will provide a recommendation to the board as to what that interest rate decision will be, and it would be highly unusual if the board went against that recommendation. Now, given the fact that right now you've got a treasurer who's only appointed Michelle Bullock, what is it, less than 2 months ago, effectively now saying, well, I think we probably can go without a rate rise, despite the fact that inflation is much higher than anticipated. The question is now whether the board and Michelle Bullock have to assert their independence and raise interest rates. Because right now, with Australia's cash rate being well below the inflation rate, there is serious justification to raise interest rates to ensure really that inflation at the end of 2025 comes back to that target band of 2 to 3%, which is what their stated aim is. And so hopefully that's the case. But tomorrow we're going to see that home prices have actually risen again. And in some capital cities are at record levels. And so this again is adding to the inflation story and the fact that many people right now are enduring these higher interest rates and are still spending.
Just Ross, very quickly, do you think that commentary from the Treasurer, from the government is inappropriate?
I don't think it was appropriate at the time. I think if he had his chance, he might withdraw some of those words. The fact is that every treasurer, doesn't matter what party they've been in, has at some stage tried to jawbone the Reserve Bank, despite their independence. And, the Reserve Banks, by and large, have expressed their own independence. And you can remember the Reserve Bank at one stage raised interest rates on Tony Abbott during an election campaign. Now, the fact of the matter is that happens. And that is showing the genuine independence of a central bank board. They're doing what needs to be done. And right now, there is growing evidence that this Reserve Bank, sad for mortgage holders, needs to raise interest rates higher to try and quell the inflation.
Such a big problem. Ross, before we go, Workplace Relations Minister Tony Burke, he's been forging ahead with these highly unpopular workplace relations reforms. He calls them closing loopholes bill. He's now admitting today, front page of the Australian newspaper, that he does need to make some changes because there is just such major opposition to them. Do you think his proposed reforms are going to go far enough to win over both the business community and employer groups?
Of course they won't. There's no doubt that they will not, because do bear in mind that this is a union-based agenda that's been pushed, and it's actually managed to unite every employer body in the country against these changes, and most of the major companies as well. But the reality is, I think what Tony Burke somehow misses is that the world has changed from organised labour. The world is a more flexible place, and businesses and individuals need flexibility in their lives. Now, that's flexibility as to whether you want to be a casual, whether you want one job or whether you want a part-time job on the weekend, whatever it might be, there needs to be flexibility. And if you have very rigid laws, some of them which protect people, I make no bones about that. But the fact of the matter is you still need to provide the flexibility in the labour force to enable business to be able to grow or shrink. And if our economy after these interest rate rises is starting to decline, you also need the ability to start to put off labour. And that is a reason why many businesses take on casuals, knowing ultimately that those people can be let go if business starts to slow down. That's the reality of the way in which the business world works.
All right, Ross Greenwood, amazing analysis. And of course, you can catch Ross every day at 4:30, right before my show. Thank you so much for your time. Now, coming up, Sydney criminal lawyer Sam Macedoni will join me. He's warning that those accused of misinformation under the government's proposed laws will have fewer rights than murderers. It's extraordinary. I'm also going to speak a bit later in the show with the emotional father of a young girl who was murdered at the October 7 dance festival. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, as you know, the Albanese government is forging ahead with proposed misinformation laws. Under the bill, Australians accused of spreading misinformation online would have fewer protections than those of suspected arsonists and murderers when it comes to self-incrimination. One of the legal experts very concerned about this is Sam Macedoni, principal of Macedoni Legal. He's an accredited specialist in criminal law and joins me now. Sam, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, why is this? Because clearly, police can't compel someone to give evidence. But under this legislation, if someone doesn't appear before ACMA, they can be charged $8,000 a day. Talk us through this.
Well, this legislation or proposed legislation gives ACMA the right to compel someone who they believe has been the subject of spreading misinformation to come and give evidence at a time and place that they elect. And if you don't do that, you can be fined $8,000 per day.
For every day you don't show up?
For every day you don't show up. Now, if you're charged with murder or some arsonist offence or some terrible sexual offence, you have a right to remain silent. In other words, no one can make you answer or compel you to give information about what is alleged. But in this case, ACMA can, and that just seems to me to be an incredible position where your right to silence has been taken away from you. Your right to free speech has been taken away from you, because unless you say something that they agree with, they will say it's misinformation and you can't do it. And you can be fined and can be compelled to come and give evidence before ACMA.
And we should remember that ACMA, which is the Australian Communication Media Authority, is a government body. It's a government entity. So, we're talking about people being accused of misinformation would be hauled before a government body. How can a government body possibly decide what is misinformation, what's factual, when they don't have they don't have all the information. No. They're not investigative journalists. We have first-hand sources giving us information. A government body can't possibly make those calls.
No, it's not up to them to decide what is misinformation and what isn't misinformation. All of us have a mind of our own. We can listen to whatever anyone indicates is their opinion. We can either accept it or we can reject it. I mean, it's not up to a bureaucrat to tell us what we can and can't hear. It's really a form of controlling the information that's made available to the public. I mean, only dictatorships have that right of control. They can't, I mean, as you say, it's a bureaucrat. What gives them the right to decide what is correct information and what is not correct information? It's too much power. It's a very coercive power.
And Sam, during the debate ahead of the Voice referendum, we saw the Prime Minister, we saw Linda Burney, we saw other government cabinet ministers stand up and accuse those who supported the No campaign of running misinformation. It wasn't misinformation. You might have a different point of view, exactly, but it clearly wasn't misinformation. If this is what the government and potentially a government entity is calling misinformation, then I think your comparisons to a dictatorship would be right.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the No campaigners had the right to indicate what their personal view was of this referendum. It was up to the individual to make a choice, but it wasn't up to a bureaucrat to tell us what we can and cannot listen to and what we can and cannot accept. If they call that misinformation, then God help us. I mean, there are all sorts of people that express opinions about all sorts of things that could get into a very big trouble just because some government bureaucrat doesn't agree with them.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that the government's still forging ahead with these misinformation laws. It's time that they walked away from
shocking abuse of the freedom of speech and our right to silence. It just can't happen.
Yeah. Sam Macedoni, thanks so much
Thank
for
you,
your
Sharri.
time. Still to come, Hamas released another video of some Israeli hostages. Liz Storer and Paul Murray will join me to discuss more on that. And also later in the show, coming up, my interview with the emotional father of a young girl killed at the Israeli dance festival on October 7. Welcome back. Here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. Fighting is ongoing deep inside Gaza between Hamas fighters, Hamas terrorists and Israeli troops after a female soldier was rescued from captivity. A man appeared in court today over the alleged murder of 34-year-old barrister Alice Rose McShearer, whose body was found in Perth's Crown Towers. Employment Minister Tony Burke is agreeing to changes to his controversial IR reforms to appease businesses. But Ross Greenwood has just told us they won't go far enough. Wild winds wreaked havoc with bushfires burning on the east coast. A number of evacuation orders have been given in Queensland and New South Wales. And King Charles is in Kenya on his first overseas Commonwealth visit. He's under pressure to apologise for abuses committed during British colonial rule. And let's bring now our weekly Tuesday panel. Sky News hosts Paul Murray and Liz Storer. Welcome to you both. Hello. Now, let's start with what I spoke about in my editorial tonight, the Prime Minister's very clear lack of leadership when it comes to the explosion in anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Australia. I mean, we're seeing this globally. We had those horrifying scenes at Dagestan Airport and hotels in Russia, Paul. But in Australia, The community is terrified. There is massive anti-Semitism. He hasn't held a press conference. He hasn't done anything about it.
Yeah, certainly also when I was noticing in your editorial, as always, fascinating to watch, was these 6 former prime ministers can't agree on anything, right? Literally cannot agree on anything, but it represents our national leadership from 1996 all the way until literally 2022. They never sign anything. The only time you'll ever get them in the same place is, frankly, at the funeral of a former Prime Minister. The decision that they took is the ultimate way of showing that Albo's in the wrong spot, of showing that Albo has not said the right things, particularly about anti-Semitism and what is happening in the fear in those communities, because clearly Malcolm Turnbull is the author of it. Of course, Wentworth, significant population. He was clear about what that issue was, informed, of course, by not just a worldview, but also Josh Frydenberg about the need for that statement to be made. When asked about it today, as you played the grab, rather than saying completely endorse what they say, pick a couple of lines from the statement and double down, he finds a way around the statement. I don't know why. I honestly don't know why. Now, I know that there's an opinion piece that's in the Sydney Morning Herald today that suggests one of the problems Joe Biden may well have in part of his re-election is that the extreme left of his party does not like his support for Israel and may well sit out the next election, and that would be a significant enough population to potentially deny a re-election for Biden. Is that what Albo's playing with here? But I wouldn't think that that's statistically big enough. Instead, it's a worldview, and it's a worldview that you've been showing he's always had. And while he may change many things on his way to the lodge, I don't think he's changed his view on this.
Liz, if what Paul suggests is right, if Albanese is putting politics and votes in communities in Western Sydney above what is right, above standing up for anti-Semitism, that's disgusting.
Absolutely. This guy's an utter shill. And we've seen this from our premiers also. All lip service, no strong action. We've had massive marches this weekend, most recently in Sydney, yelling Allahu Akbar, talking about we stand with you, Palestine, no matter what you do. The people saying that, inciting this kind of hatred, they know what happened on the 7th. So when I say I stand with you, Palestine, no matter what you do, you're talking about the rape, the mutilation, the murder, the ripping unborn babies out of their mothers' stomachs. You stand with that? We've yet to see any strong display of action from our premiers or our Prime Minister on this massive, we can't really call it a rise in anti-Semitism because obviously it's been there all along,
well, but it's now
simmering underneath the surface. Yeah, and it's taken this to see it come to the fore. And absolutely nothing but lip service from our leaders. It's utterly disgusting.
Sorry, Liz, didn't mean to interrupt. I apologise. You never do it to me, so I'll never do it to you. I know the rules around here.
Go ahead, Paul.
Now,
we want to hear you.
The issue, though, is that what's fascinating to see here is, and we've been talking about this a bit at 9 o'clock, right, which is about what is different. So you see today Netanyahu talking about there was no retreat after Pearl Harbor, no retreat after 9/11. And I think what's something worth considering in the conversation, right, and it's not whataboutism and all the rest of it, right, is that Western countries have not been able to win wars the way they used to when there weren't any cameras around. Why? Because the appetite that the media or the wider public has for civilian casualties, it's not there, right?
Well, so ISIL was in recent time. The fight against, ISIS in Mosul, that was in recent times. There were mobile phones then. Well, Afghanistan, 46,000, I think, civilians killed.
100%, yeah. But I'm saying the early days in 2001 of what happened in Afghanistan was pre-smartphone, right? You've got this scenario and you've got in Hamas people who are weaponising the images of civilian casualties, knowing
that's why they won't let the civilians leave.
Correct.
That's why they won't
I'm not sitting here whataboutism. I'm not finding a way. I'm just saying is that what makes not the task difficult, but what our leaders have to muscle up against is to say, OK, I'm going to maintain the moral clarity that I had when there weren't the cameras there, when there was the sense of right and wrong, because the reality is if they're going to start to sort of move to wherever Twitter goes on any one day, they're going to provide piss-weak statements like the one that Albo did.
But I think the 6 former Prime Ministers got that balance Beautifully. They express sorrow, and we all feel sorrow. There is no one who doesn't feel sorrow for any mother who loses her children, no matter what their nationality or background. They got that right by saying this is Hamas doing it. This is Hamas who sparked this war, who stopped their own civilians from leaving, who used them as human shields. I mean, they literally put their operations under major hospitals.
Well, and if the left wants to create a sense of pressure in that area, where's the conversation about Egypt? Where's the conversation about Egypt opening the southern gate?
The 19 Arab countries surrounding
creating
it, the 52 majority Muslim countries won't take a single Gazan. What's going on here? Why aren't they directing their eye where it belongs? You mentioned Dagestan. At least in Russia, they saw 80 arrests. Now, if you look at the lynch mob that ran through that airport, their intention was very clear. I think we would have seen another October 7th right there and then had those people disembarked from the plane. But Russia took some action. We haven't seen a single arrest that we're made aware of. No show of action, nothing but lip service. It's got to stop, because what that does is tell people of that persuasion it's okay. You won't even get a slap on the wrist.
We still haven't found the organisers of the Opera House thing.
Yeah.
I don't believe that for a second.
And the police were there and they just didn't do anything.
But remember, the organisers of that initial protest put themselves up for media appearances the following day, all right? Which meant those people owned it as the organisers, which meant they could have been fined $22,000. They haven't been. Not once.
Yeah.
And you notice as well that there's no conversation on that leadership of those protests. It turns around and says, well, anyone who says anything terrible, go away. Well, what about the signs? Okay? They have to police that behaviour as well.
Exactly.
But also, we all now know that the sentiment behind those protests is purely anti-Semitic. And it's been such a shock to see that this hatred of me, my community, Josh Frydenberg, Mark Dreyfus, business leaders, is among us. Don't you think that has been just such a shock to see that?
Well, again, I mean, when we go back to the last time Australia had to consciously deal with what's happening in the Middle East, we're going back the best part of 20 years, all right? The migrant mix is a lot different than where we were 20 years ago, but also the penchant for the police service to not offend as opposed to crack down and say, no, the joy of this country is come from anywhere, have any connection anywhere from any faith. But in this country, we don't go after people for who they are.
Well, it's on our government, because they have imported by the masses people who don't share our values. Clearly, that's what we're seeing play out in our streets.
All right, we'll see you 9 o'clock tonight, Paul, and you at 10 o'clock. Thank you both so much.
Love you,
Sharri.
And still to come, after the break, the father of an Israeli who died at that dance festival will join me. It's an emotional interview. Stay tuned. It was a music festival for peace that resulted in thousands of unsuspecting festival goers running for their lives. Hamas terrorists launched a surprise attack. 260 young Israelis were killed, gunned down, others taken hostage, beaten and raped. One of those who lost their lives that day is Danielle, the daughter of well-known Israeli businessman Eel Walman. Danielle's boyfriend Noam also was killed. I spoke with Eel earlier. Eel, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm so deeply sorry for your loss, for your beautiful daughter Danielle and her boyfriend Noam.
Thank you.
Look, take me back to October 7. It's been about 3 weeks since then. What was the first that you heard something was wrong?
So I was in Indonesia, in like a very isolated island, and then my son Guy called me and said Danielle's not answering her phone and something's going down south, she may be missing. And so I started understanding, and I started hearing more things going on in the south. So I took a helicopter off the island and then took a plane here. We landed around, I think, 1:30 or 2 a.m. in the morning. On Monday morning at 6:30, already started heading south. I was going to find Danielle, my youngest daughter. I had our location on the GPS. of her phone sent us like an SOS message of emergency and location. So on the way, we saw a huge amount of cars. They were completely hit by bullets, were destroyed, were burned. A huge amount and a massive pile of cars along both sides of the road. We kept going, and then we found the car that they were in with friends. The car was completely bullet holes all over. We think that there were 3 creatures with Kalashnikovs from behind that shot them from like 200 meters and approaching the car. We saw the back seat completely full of holes. The bullets went through the back seats and also into the front seats. Both airbags were deployed and were full of blood, and it was like a big mess. North of the car, about 150 meters, we found a Gaza SUV, a Toyota SUV with 3 bodies. The bodies from the first engagement were still warm, and you saw that the bodies that we found close to where Danielle's car was were about 3 days old, and you also felt that. We saw 1 body outside of the car and 2 bodies inside the car. And then we saw south to Danielle's car, or the car she was in, a motorcycle from Gaza, which I think was also engaged in the murder of Danielle and Noam.
I'm so sorry, Eyal. I mean, that's just so devastating. You risked your own life, obviously, to go into the area. Terrorists were still active at the time. Were you holding out hope that you might have found her alive?
Yeah, even then, after I saw the car first, I didn't tell my 2 kids and my ex-wife the situation that I've seen. And I was still hoping that first, maybe she was not in the car. And second, that, maybe she got wounded and she's been able to crawl outside and hide somewhere, or maybe even taken hostage into Gaza. I was really hoping that she's alive. And we went searching for them. One was where the party was, one was the parking lot of the party. And we kept searching for Danielle that day and the day after. Eventually, we got the word that both Danielle and Noam were identified as murdered on Wednesday morning.
And I understand that Danielle and Noam were planning their wedding, and then instead you're organising funerals for them.
Yeah, they were starting to talk about marriage. I don't think they were already planning a wedding, but they definitely, Danielle told me like a week before that, Dad, I think that I'm going to marry Noam. And our mom told me she had a dream one of the mornings last week that she saw Danielle in a wedding dress, which is something that will never happen.
I'm so sorry, Eyal. It's just beyond words. This trauma that you're going through, that so many thousands of families in Israel like you are going through. Can you tell us about Danielle? What did she love to do? What were her hopes for the future?
Danielle was an amazing girl. She was born in Palo Alto, California, and she grew up for the first 4 years of her life in the United States. Then we moved back to Israel. She loved to dance. She danced everywhere. She loved horses. She loved dogs. She had dogs. She was just all about animals. She didn't hurt anything. She started to do photography with her mother. Her mother is like a very good photographer here, an amateur photographer, but very busy with that. So she went to multiple trips with Ella, with her mom, for photography. She, in the army, was a shooting instructor, and she was training infantry special units in shooting. That's how she met Noam. Noam was in Givati, one of the special forces, infantry special forces here. They met while she was training his team. And then they got together and stayed together for about 6 years, living the life they wanted. And then on Friday went to celebrate, peace, freedom, and love, and were murdered.
Eel, I mean, you talk about Hamas, you call them creatures. They are worse than ISIS. What they've done is more barbaric to babies, to children, to women, to your daughter, Danielle. Look, you personally have a strong business record of bringing Jews and Palestinians together. Obviously, Hamas is a terror organisation, but has all of this, has what's unfolded on October 7 changed your worldview in any way?
No, it did not. So first, we need to differentiate. We're now at a defense operation, and we need to eliminate Hamas, and anyone associated with Hamas needs to be eliminated, the same as the Western world has done to ISIS. We're not against Muslims. We're not against Islam. We respect Islam. We respect Muslims. But extreme organizations like Hamas, like Islamic Jihad, should be eliminated. And at the same time, and after we do this, we continue to reach out for peace. We want to stop killing each other. We want to be able to live next to each other in a synergetic way, and it could be an amazing life for both people in two countries. And our hand is always reaching out to find a partner. I've worked for more than 2 decades to find Palestinian partners to work with me on peace. I've had design centers in Rawabi, Hebron, and Nablus, and also in Gaza. I've donated and raised more than $360,000 for a hospital in Gaza. And I've done a peace initiative in the last two years.
Incredible.
We need
it's incredible.
to have the Palestinians, thank you. We need to have the Palestinians understand and come and ask, let's live in peace. Because if we continue to killing each other, it's not the right thing. I think our army has more technology, has more capabilities. We need to find a way to stop killing each other and strive for peace together.
Look, just finally, Eel, I mean, what happened to Danielle, Noam and 1,400 other Israelis on October 7 is the most brutal, tragic thing that could ever happen to any humans. And yet what we're seeing in the Western world are massive, massive protests in support of Palestinians. These protesters aren't condemning the Hamas terror attacks at all. They're protesting against Israel. I'm sure you've seen the images globally, including here in Australia. What do you make of them?
You know, first, I think that they're doing better work in propaganda, in explaining and stuff like this. But I think when people look down and understand really what happened in October 7, I'm talking about my personal story, but there's 1,400 people that were murdered during that morning, that day, and that afternoon. The people that came in, or the creatures that came in, did awful things in many places, just unbelievable, inhuman things. They raped, they burned, they cut open, they beheaded, they've burned alive, they've done awful things to people. This is something that you cannot even describe, and there's multiple videos. And this is why the international world should understand they should support Israel to complete this operation, and after this, help us strive for peace.
Eel, thank you so much for your courage in sitting here and talking to us this evening. I can't even imagine how difficult that must be for you, and I'm so deeply sorry for everything that you and fellow Israeli citizens are going through.
Thank you very much. We'll be okay. We'll win this war, and we'll be striving again.
Now, before I go, a quick note of thanks to the viewer who has now added a Magen David to the cross she wears on her necklace, to the viewer who has added an Israel friendship pin to his jacket, to the viewer who sent flowers, all in support of the Jewish community. Thank you. Now, tomorrow night, I've got a big interview with former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Don't miss it. I'll see you tomorrow at 5 p.m. And here's Rita Panahi.